The olla knocked with steam. The masa cooked. She said her eyes are China. The vowel switched on an aura, a shine that sheens the threshold. The vowel was spell, an eye that might we, an eye that echoes how we're seen and see. Identity. Ay Dios, she exclaimed, surrounded by photos, niños and nietos, where I'm the only Chino. How might I see through my family's eyes, an owl's eyes in ojos, and one in its lid turned sideways, mu. I wondered with her at the table where we placed one olive, ojo negro, in each hoja, that worn folio for field corn's field notes. What does that dark eye in the ear's husk see? Well, the story is set in my nana, my Mexican-American grandmother's kitchen. And we're making tamales. And she tells me her eyes are como una china. She has Chinese eyes. So it's a story about thinking about identity. It's a story about storytelling. It's also a story about race, racial categorization. Chino is a racial category that goes back at least as far as the Spanish galleons in the 1500s. Those ships that crossed the Pacific from Spanish colonial Philippines and Manila to Spanish colonial Acapulco. It's a word that speaks to this long history of free and enslaved Asians in the Americas. It's a word that speaks to racial formation under colonialism and imperialism. And Chino is a word that I grew up hearing, that people called me, that I heard other people use. And so the poem, in addition to having this scene with my grandmother, is a way of reclaiming that, that term, that word, Chino. And it's a way of, through that word, and particularly through that vowel switch of the I, from the I to the Spanish E sound. It's a way of both hearing and seeing my family's narratives, historical narratives, my family's cultures, seeing through their perspectives and through their languages, to come to a sense of my own identity. The poem is a lyric poem. It is a sonnet. And so that form is often focused on a lyrical I, and that I is often seen as individual. But for me, that's complicated. And I'm interested in, just as well, I'll speak to my identity. I'm Chicano, I'm mestizo, and I'm Chinese American. And just as my identity has a multiplicity, so should my poems have and contain a multiplicity. And so the poem is working across culture, across languages, to reclaim that multiplicity, to celebrate and perhaps sing an I that might we. The making of tamales is a group activity. It's not a it's not Top Chef. It's not a singular one chef kind of thing, right? It is a community, a communal act. And when my family gets together to make food, we tell stories. And I would also say this particular setting, my nana, my grandmother's house, as the poem talks about, is filled with photos. Um, we're just surrounded by so many photos of grandchildren, of tias and tios. And so it's not unlike a museum or a kind of archive that's been curated by my nana. For me, the poem's about seeing through both my family's eyes, and that's uh, also the linguistic eyes, right? How they say I, how they spell I, so that the poem is inclusive of both ojos and then also the Chinese radical for I. Um, and in some ways, just as there's a coming together or a multiplicity of 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 seeing, there's also this kind of synesthesia that the poem's interested in, that we might hear and see at the same time. And so that's what's interesting to me about that final line. What does the dark eye, the olive, um, what does that dark eye in the ear's husk see? So that combination of sound and hearing, which is so important to poetry, both the visual and the sonic coming together. Largely my upbringing, hearing Spanish on my maternal side, hearing Chinese on my paternal side, and not speaking those languages at home with my mother, but speaking English. Um, my experience was hearing those languages um, before, trying to read them. So I would be oftentimes in Spanish class, and I would see words in my textbook that I wouldn't know until the teacher said it out loud. And then I would have this aha moment. I'm like, oh, I know that word. I grew up hearing that word. So there was always this kind of disconnect between linguistically between the visual and sonic recognition of language. And I think a lot of folks who um, have similar relationship to their heritage language or heritage languages have that experience. And I feel like that kind of disconnect between the visual and the sonic, um, I feel like it had a real influence on me um, uh, uh, as a poet. I think that I grew up hearing the music of language and languages um, more so than understanding or having the meaning of those languages. And that musicality is so important to me as a poet. I think it's really been an influence, not just an influence, but an inspiration to work towards that musicality along with the written form.